Welcome back. I talked in an earlier lecture about the Celtic revival movement in Wales and Scotland. In this lecture, we're going to continue to look at the Celtic revival, but this time we'll be concentrating specifically on Ireland. In Ireland, the reappropriation of Celtic literature and art was more politically oriented than in Scotland and Wales. There hadn't been serious political unrest in Wales since the late Middle Ages. In Wales, the interest in the Celtic past was mostly confined to the cultural sphere, especially with literature and music, and of course, the Welsh language. The story was slightly different in Scotland because of the later, not entirely accurate association between the Jacobite rebellions and Celtic identity. Still, the question of the political relationship between Scotland and England wasn't a burning issue until the late 20th century. Matters were very different in Ireland. There, the question of Irish, and specifically Celtic identity, did become broadly political, though this identification with the Irish past manifested itself differently for different people. In order to understand the relationship between the Celtic revival and Irish politics, we need to catch up quickly on Irish political developments in the 19th century, and then we'll look at the 4 areas where Celtic revivalism was most important in Ireland: sports, language, art, and literature. The 19th century in Ireland was dominated by a debate over the future of Ireland's relationship with Britain. In 1798, there was a major rebellion in Ireland led by a group called the United Irishmen, who were an explicitly non-sectarian Republican group. They wanted a democratic government for all of Ireland that was totally separate from Britain. But they really saw themselves as part of an international movement. They were very influenced by both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The leader of the United Irishmen, a man called Theobald Wolfetone, was a Protestant lawyer from Dublin who had spent considerable time in Belfast. The nationalism of the United Irishmen was supposed to transcend religion and certainly to transcend ethnicity. There was no sense that being an Irish nationalist was confined to people of a certain ethnic heritage or religion. The rebellion of 1798 was seen by the British government as a very serious threat to national security because it led to French troops landing on Irish soil. And even though these troops were very quickly defeated, the British wanted to be sure that such an invasion never happened again. Until this time, the Irish had had their own parliament, but in 1800, the Act of Union did away with the Irish Parliament and brought Ireland under the direct rule of the British Parliament in London. This was supposed to help with security, and the British government also promised that an all-British Parliament would be in a better position to guarantee the rights of Catholics in Ireland than the local Protestant landlords in Ireland. At the time, many Catholics in Ireland, including the Catholic bishops, backed the Union. Fairly quickly after the passage of the Act of Union, it became clear that the new constitutional arrangement was more beneficial for some groups in Ireland than others. The more heavily industrialized northeast of the country, which had been settled extensively by Protestant Scots and Englishmen in the 17th century, did very well. But the rest of the country, which was more heavily Catholic, failed to see the economic gains they had expected, and disenchantment with the Union only increased due to the catastrophic effects of the Great Famine of the 1840s, when the potato crop failed repeatedly, leading to widespread death from starvation and disease, and massive emigration. Throughout the 19th century, then, there was a lively debate over the best way for Ireland to express its relationship with Britain. There were 3 main strands of opinion. The first was unionism, that is, the belief that the Act of Union was a good thing. Most unionists were Protestants who identified strongly with Britain. There were also 2 strands of nationalist opinion. The less radical one was constitutional nationalism. The constitutional nationalists wanted to see Ireland recover at least some of the political autonomy it had had before the Act of Union, while remaining connected to Britain in some way. There were prominent constitutional nationalists from both the Protestant and Catholic communities. In fact, the 2 most famous Irish politicians of the 19th century came from opposite sides of the religious divide. The Catholic Daniel O'Connell, who died in 1847, led a successful effort to repeal the law that barred Catholics from serving in political office. But he failed in his campaign to get the Act of Union repealed and restore the Irish Parliament. I'll say more about O'Connell's relationship to the Irish language and Irish history a bit later on. The Protestant Charles Stewart Parnell was an ardent Irish patriot who built on O'Connell's work by working towards the slightly less ambitious goal of achieving home rule for Ireland. Parnell came very close to achieving this goal, but he was brought down in 1890 by his adulterous relationship with a woman named Kitty O'Shea. Many public figures condemned Parnell, including the Catholic bishops of Ireland. The Parnell scandal split the constitutional nationalist community, and it was another 2 decades before home rule came to the top of the political agenda again. A far smaller and more radical fringe of the nationalist movement wanted not just home rule, but an absolute rupture of any ties to Great Britain, achieved by means of an armed struggle. I won't go into the details of the various doomed uprisings that these rebels engaged in. I just want to note that the name that they became known as was the Fenians, and this was a direct reference to the ancient Irish Fianna, the warrior band of Finn McCool. So although the Fenians did draw their legacy from the rebels of '98, who were not particularly interested in Irish literature, these new rebels were making an explicit nod to a specifically Gaelic Irish past. I have laid out these 3 political alternatives for Ireland because I think that knowing about this larger debate helps to set some of the cultural developments of the 19th century into context. People were really trying hard to figure out what it meant to be Irish and how Irish identity could or could not be reconciled with British rule. Obviously, this identity crisis was largely confined to those who fell in one or the other of the nationalist camps. Unionists felt no anxiety about their identity, since they saw themselves primarily as British. They were more anxious to be sure that Britain did not abandon them. But within the nationalist community, there were several main areas of emphasis. Some worked most intensively on political change, while others concentrated on trying to improve the economic situation for Irish farmers. Still others devoted their energies into a movement to shore up the Irishness of Ireland by preserving and reviving its distinctive cultural heritage. As I said at the outset of this lecture, this effort proceeded on several fronts, from athletics to language to literature to art. And what's interesting here is that these efforts overlap with each other quite a bit. Many people were involved in more than one of these areas. Like the organizations that were founded in the late 18th century to revive the Celtic past of Wales and Scotland, these movements too sought to create an infrastructure that would support the Irish cultural revival. I'll talk about them roughly in the order in which these movements coalesced. The first of these organized movements was devoted to the revival of ancient Irish sports. So what were ancient Irish sports, and what claim do they have to being ancient? The one we have the most evidence for is hurling. In the Irish epic The Táin, there are references to the hero Cuchulainn playing a game with the boy troop at the royal court of Ulster that involved striking a ball with a stick. He first demonstrates his heroic potential by beating all the other boys single-handed. So that's an impressive literary legacy for the sport of hurling. We also know that it was played in the Middle Ages because it was one of the Irish games that the English settlers were banned from playing under the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 as part of the effort to keep them from going native. We know less about the other main Irish sport that was revived in the 19th century, namely Gaelic football, which is sort of a cross between soccer and rugby. But there are references to football that go back as far as the 14th century. Both hurling and football were in decline by the middle of the 19th century due to competition from sports brought in from England, especially soccer and cricket. In response, the Gaelic Athletic Association, or GAA, was founded on November 1st, 1884, by a teacher from County Clare named Michael Cusack in the billiard room at Hayes Hotel in Thurles, County Limerick. One of the other key sponsors of the new organization was Thomas William Croke, Archbishop of Cashel. Archbishop Croke was an ardent nationalist who had supported the Land League, which was a movement that was trying to obtain better conditions for Irish tenant farmers. He believed strongly in an Irish Ireland and later supported the Irish language movement, which I'll talk about shortly. Here is what Archbishop Croke had to say about the decline of Irish sports. Indeed, if we continue traveling in the next score years in the direction that we have been going in for some time past, condemning the sports that were practiced by our forefathers, effacing our national features as though we were ashamed of them, and putting on, with England's stuffs and broadcloths, her masher habits, and such other effeminate follies as she may recommend, we had better at once, and publicly, abjure our nationality, clap hands for joy at the sight of the Union Jack, and place England's bloody red exultantly above the green. Wow. I'm going to jump ahead in the narrative for a moment to follow the story of Archbishop Croke. He was one of the casualties of the Parnell divorce scandal. After the scandal broke, he became disillusioned and withdrew from active politics. But he left a lasting legacy in the GAA. The GAA Stadium in Dublin, Croke Park, which is one of the 5 biggest stadiums in Europe, is named after him. Croke Park was the site of one of the most notorious episodes in the Irish War of Independence in 1920, when members of the British Special Troops known as the Black and Tans fired on the spectators at a Gaelic football match. The attack was launched in retaliation for a series of assassinations of British security officers that had taken place that morning under the orders of the Director of Intelligence for the Irish Republican Army, Michael Collins. The attack in Croke Park killed 14 civilians. There was clear symbolism in attacking a GAA match, because by this period, the GAA had become clearly identified with radical Irish republicanism. How had this happened? Well, starting with its foundation in 1884, the GAA became extremely popular, with hundreds of clubs all around Ireland to foster the playing of the main Gaelic games, which, by the way, exist in both male and female varieties. And the female version of hurling is called camogie. The movement was strongly nationalist in flavor, and you could even be kicked out at first for playing cricket or any other foreign game. This emphasis on Gaelicization obviously dovetailed very clearly with a nationalist political agenda. And by the early 1900s, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the radical group associated with the Fenian legacy, had heavily infiltrated the GAA. This is not to say that all GAA members were Republicans, but many were. The next aspect of cultural nationalism I want to talk about is language. Ironically, there was an upsurge of interest in the Irish language in the late 19th century, just as it was largely dying out as a spoken language among the people of Ireland. There were many causes for the decline of Irish. One cause was the repeal of the penal laws. From the 17th century onward, legislation known as the penal laws had restricted economic and political opportunities for Catholics in both Britain and Ireland. But once it was legal for Catholics in Ireland to join the professions, there was a much greater incentive for them to learn English. Irish-speaking parents specifically sought out English instruction for their children to help them get ahead. The famous hedge schools, the informal schools in the Irish countryside that taught Catholic children who could not or would not attend official Protestant-run government schools, taught many subjects, including, in some cases, ancient Greek. But English was one of the most requested subjects. So part of the decline of Irish was due to the hard-headed decisions of many individual Irish people to adopt the linguistic habits of the ruling class. There was a more melancholy reason for the decline of Irish, of course, which was that a high percentage of Irish speakers fell victim to the Great Irish Potato Famine of the 1840s. The famine struck especially severely in the western part of Ireland, which was the more rural, less economically developed area, where the people were particularly dependent on the potato for subsistence. These were also the areas where Irish remained the everyday language of the peasant classes. When the potato blight hit, these subsistence farmers had very little to fall back on. The lucky ones emigrated, either to England or to North America or even to Australia. The unlucky ones did not survive. A map of the decline of spoken Irish tracks very closely with a map of the areas worst affected by the famine. Not all nationalists were dismayed by the decline of Irish. A prime example is Daniel O'Connell, who was raised speaking Irish in the western part of County Kerry, which is still part of the official Gaeltacht, or Irish-speaking region, to this day. O'Connell took a hard-headed approach to his native language. He said, "Although the Irish language is connected with many recollections that twine round the hearts of Irishmen, yet the superior utility of the English tongue as the medium of all modern communication is so great that I can witness, without a sigh, the gradual disuse of Irish." O'Connell was certainly very aware of his country's history and used it to his advantage for political purposes. He held his famous giant rallies in favor of repealing the Act of Union at sites around Ireland that were associated with past glories, such as the Hill of Tara, the ancient ritual assembly point. So the Irish past was important to him, but the language, not so much. O'Connell died in 1847, the worst year of the famine. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, Ireland was preoccupied with survival and recovery. It took another generation before a movement arose that would try to undo the linguistic damage caused by famine, emigration, and assimilation. The organization that took on that challenge was the Gaelic League, or Conradh na Gaeilge in Irish, which was founded in 1893 by three men: Father Eugene O'Growney, Owen MacNeill, and Douglas Hyde. Father O'Growney was a priest who grew up speaking no Irish at all, but he became interested in the language at school and began spending all his holidays in the west of Ireland among Irish speakers, and he later became a professor of Irish at the Catholic seminary at Maynooth. MacNeill was a great scholar of early Irish history, and he later played an interesting part in the Easter Rising of 1916, when members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and associated groups issued the Proclamation of the Republic and declared Ireland's independence. MacNeill had tried unsuccessfully to countermand the order to start the rebellion. Father O'Growney was obviously a Catholic, as was MacNeill, but Douglas Hyde was a Protestant from County Sligo. He was active in literary circles in both London and Dublin before he co-founded the League. Hyde was an ardent cultural nationalist. He gave a famous lecture in 1892 called "The Necessity of De-Anglicizing Ireland." In my lecture on the Tudor conquest of Ireland, I talked about English efforts to Anglicize Ireland, and this effort had been partially successful. But as I said earlier, many of the Irish themselves saw it in their self-interest to learn English and abandon Irish. This is the phenomenon that Hyde is deploring in his speech, and he wanted to see the trend reversed. It's an interesting speech, actually quite subtle in its reasoning, and rather inclusive politically. In fact, he explicitly says that his point of view ought also to claim the sympathies of every intelligent unionist. He wasn't opposed to Irish people using English, as long as the Irish language and Irish literature were not neglected as a result. The aim of the League was primarily to revive the Irish language at all levels and to introduce it into the national curriculum. The League also campaigned, often successfully, for bilingual street signs and signposts. All over Ireland, there were people gathering together in local branches, learning Irish. At first, the membership of the League was primarily urban and bourgeois. The irony of this was that the League tended to romanticize the remaining Irish speakers of Ireland, the rural inhabitants of the West, whom most Gaelic League members did not know personally, as if there was something innately pure about their lifestyle. Douglas Hyde used to talk about the piety of the Irish Gael, who sees the hand of God in every place, in every time, in everything. Now, plenty of people thought that this was romantic nonsense. I want to quote an earlier reaction to this sort of sentiment by an Anglican clergyman named Sidney Smith, who thought that focusing on nationalism distracted people from their very real material problems. What trash to be bawling in the streets about the Green Isle, the Isle of the Ocean, the bold anthem of Erin go Bragh. A far better anthem would be Erin go bread and cheese, Erin go cabins that will keep out the rain, Erin go pantaloons without holes in them. But many people believed strongly in this essentially romantic notion of an Irish-speaking rural Ireland as some sort of ideal to aspire to, and it would have tremendous influence in the early years of Irish independence. The real importance of the Gaelic League is that it created this ideal of an Irish Ireland that was going to influence future nationalists very strongly. After a slow start, the League gained many more members after 1899 due to the outbreak of the Boer War between Britain and the Boer rebels in South Africa. Many Irishmen sided with the Boers, and they joined the League as an expression of anti-British partisanship. Still, the League was officially non-political for quite some time. The idea was that politics was going to follow language, and this was part of a larger movement in European life towards concentrating on cultural means of expressing nationalist aspirations. Political views within the Gaelic League varied. For many, the idea was that if Irish were revived, that would give a boost to Irish nationalism, a credibility that would aid in achieving independence, while other members did not aspire to Irish independence. This officially non-political stance was maintained until 1915, when the Gaelic League finally committed itself to independence, at which point Douglas Hyde resigned. Many of the participants in the Easter Rebellion of 1916 were members of the Gaelic League, and there was in fact some tension among the rebels between those who were competent in spoken Irish and those who weren't. By that point, the ability to speak Irish had become a marker of Irish nationalist credibility. There was another, much broader approach to Gaelic revival as well. This focused not on the narrow linguistic question of whether the Irish language was being spoken, but on the actual literary heritage of Ireland, regardless of the language through which one might choose to encounter it. Most of the practitioners of this form of literary revival were members of the largely Protestant Anglo-Irish community. They sought their inspiration in Old Irish mythology and folklore. The Anglo-Irish literary figure Augusta, Lady Gregory, for example, learned Old Irish, and in 1902 she published Cuchulainn of Merhevna, a well-received translation of the Táin. Lady Gregory does something very interesting with the text, however. She preserves most of the plot, but she takes out some of the stranger aspects of the original story. For example, Lady Gregory turns Cuchulainn into a conventional-looking hero. No more spiky hair and warp spasm. She also cuts out a lot of the more lurid passages having to do with sex. In short, Lady Gregory makes a hero who would be more acceptable to a 19th century bourgeois audience. And it was this normal-looking hero who was later immortalized in the famous Cuchulainn statue of 1911. This was later moved to the General Post Office in Dublin to commemorate the GPO's role as headquarters of the 1916 Rising. Still, it was very important to Lady Gregory and to her readers that she was presenting the authentic stories of the remote Irish Celtic past. The most famous name associated with the Gaelic literary revival is, of course, that of William Butler Yeats. Yeats used many Irish settings for his poems, and he often drew on specific Irish myths and tales. Just as Macpherson was inspired by the stories of Oisin in the 18th century, Yeats wrote a poem about Oisin, except he didn't claim that he had found it in an ancient manuscript. The idea is that Oisin has returned from the otherworld only to find that 300 years have gone by, and in the meantime, St. Patrick has arrived in Ireland. So Oisin tells the saint the story of his journey to the otherworld and his fairy love. Here is a brief excerpt. Sad to remember, sick with years, the swift innumerable spears, the horsemen with their floating hair, and bowls of barley, honey, and wine, those merry couples dancing in tune, and the white body that lay by mine. But the tale, though words be lighter than air, must live to be old like the wandering moon. Probably the most important works that the Gaelic revival produced were plays. Lady Gregory and Yeats co-founded the Irish Literary Theatre in 1899, later known as the Abbey Theatre, with the aim of producing Irish-themed plays. In their manifesto, they said, "We will show that Ireland is not the home of buffoonery and of easy sentiment, as it has been represented, but the home of an ancient idealism. We are confident of the support of the Irish people, who are weary of misrepresentation, in carrying out a work that is outside all the political questions that divide us." There's a lot to unpack here. Clearly, the audience for this is not purely Irish. These playwrights want an English audience to think well of Ireland. Also, you can definitely notice the scars of the recent struggles over home rule and the Parnell split. The idea is that literature can unite people rather than divide them. But just like with the Gaelic League, which was supposed to bridge the gap between nationalists of all stripes and even unionists, but ultimately was co-opted by the radical wing of nationalism, the literary movement ended up going in a very politically nationalist direction. A prime example of the intersection between politics and ancient Irish literature is Yeats's play Kathleen Ní Houlihan. The play was produced in 1902, shortly after the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 1798 Rising, and it went over very well with a nationalist audience in Dublin. It takes place in County Mayo, in the west of Ireland, during the landing of the French forces in August 1798. The Ghislaine family is preparing for the marriage of their son Michael, when we meet a mysterious old woman, originally played by Maud Gunn, a famous actress who was Yeats's great unrequited love, and she was quite an actress. She is looking for the return of her 4 fields, which are, of course, the 4 provinces of Ireland. What she wants is for Michael Ghislaine to go off and fight with the French to liberate Ireland. And over the frantic objections of his family and his fiancée, he does just that. And once he leaves, the old woman is transformed into a beautiful woman who has the look of a queen. The old woman, of course, is specifically meant to call to mind the goddess of sovereignty of the old Irish tales. This was red meat stuff to a nationalist crowd. They loved it. Yeats had a somewhat troubled conscience about his play later, since a lot of people who were involved in the Easter Rising of 1916 had seen his play. In his poem, The Man and the Echo, written in 1938, he asks, "Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot?" Not all of the plays produced at the Abbey Theatre drew so explicitly on mythological and historical themes, but they did confront the question of Irishness and Irish identity. The playwright John Millington Synge, a Protestant from County Dublin, knew the most Irish of any of these literary figures. He spent considerable time in the west of Ireland, especially in County Galway and on the Aran Islands, and he really got to know the people and the rhythms of their speech, which come out in his plays very forcefully. His most famous play is The Playboy of the Western World, first produced in 1907. It became infamous because one line in the play mentioned the word shift, a kind of woman's undergarment. When the crowd in the theater heard this word, which had become a kind of coded reference to Kitty O'Shea and the Parnell divorce scandal, they rioted. The relationship between politics and culture in Ireland was always a close one. So what does the Gaelic revival tell us about the relationship between Ireland's Celtic heritage and its modern culture? There are many continuities, of course, but in many cases, the modern revivals of ancient Irish literature have softened the edges of the original stories to make them more palatable to a modern audience. The Romanticism of the late 19th century was not comfortable with every aspect of the Celtic past. Yeats and Lady Gregory were happy to use ancient Irish stories when it suited them, but they also wanted to control the weirdness factor that came along with them. There is one final aspect to the Celtic Revival that I want to touch on, and that is the fascination with Celtic art, which has somewhat different origins from the movements in sports, language, and literature, but they became intertwined. The Celtic art movement was largely inspired by the advances in literary scholarship and archaeology in the 19th century. Antiquarian scholars were translating ancient Irish manuscripts into English, in some cases for the first time, and the Book of Kells became a symbol of Irish cultural preeminence. In 1849, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited Ireland, they were asked to sign the Book of Kells. There were also the spectacular discoveries of the Tara brooch in 1850 and the Ardagh chalice in 1868, among others. These inspired contemporary jewelry and metalwork. As I mentioned in my lecture on Celtic art, Queen Victoria loved the Tara brooch so much that she had it copied to be given as gifts. At the same time, archaeologists were working out their theory of the origins of the Celts at Hallstatt and La Tène, so all of this art was seen as connecting Ireland to a great continental tradition. The greatest impact of the revival in Celtic art was in applied arts, such as book illustration and home furnishings, where we see a huge flowering of traditional Celtic motifs, such as geometric designs, knotwork, and interlaced animals. These Celtic motifs were also used prolifically in the printed materials put out by the Gaelic League and the GAA, as well as in the programs and posters of the Abbey Theatre. Irish cultural nationalism had a distinctively Celtic look. The Celtic revival in Ireland, then, was never divorced from the great political question of how Ireland was to be defined with regard to Britain. However much some important figures in the movement, such as Douglas Hyde, wanted to keep the questions of culture and politics separate, in Ireland they were as laced together as one of the motifs from the Book of Kells.